In the autumn of 1856, a tracker named Nathaniel Voss received a message at his cabin outside Millhaven in the interior of Georgia, asking him to come at once to the Bell plantation. He was 29 years old, and among the landowners of the county, he was known for a single fact, repeated so often in local correspondence that it reads almost like a formula. He had never lost a trail. County records, later gathered into an archive and only partially recovered after a courthouse fire in 1861, describe him as a hired man, paid by the job, who worked without a badge and without a uniform, moving through swamp and pine, as though he had been raised in it rather than merely trained to it. The overseer who summoned him gave few details, and what he gave was delivered in the clipped, embarrassed tone of a man repeating instructions he did not fully understand himself. A man named Isaac Mercer, enslaved on the Bell property for 11 years, had gone missing sometime before dawn. He had taken a canvas bag of tools, a portion of cured meat, and, more troubling to the household than his absence itself, several pages torn from the plantation's ledger of births, sales, and deaths. Josiah Bell, the owner, met Nathaniel on the porch that morning and did not ask him to bring Isaac back alive or dead, a phrasing that was, in that county, customary enough to be unremarkable in its absence. He asked only for the papers. According to a deposition given decades later by a house servant who had stood near enough to hear the exchange, Bell said this twice, and each time his voice dropped, as though the request itself embarrassed him more than the loss of a laborer ever could. Nathaniel had done this kind of work since he was 18 years old. He had been raised by Bell's estate manager, a widower named Elias Crane, after losing his mother, he was told, to a fever that swept the county the year he was born. His father had never been named to him, not once, not even in the vague way that illegitimate children were sometimes given a partial explanation. He had pale skin, grey eyes, and a stillness in his manner that made men trust him around their daughters and their ledgers alike. Documents from the period list him plainly as a white man, and no one in Millhaven had reason to write otherwise. His poverty, his lack of kin, the years he had spent sleeping in Crane's tool shed rather than in a proper house, were explained away as the ordinary misfortune of an orphan raised on charity. Nobody asked further. In a county where family determined nearly everything a man could own, borrow, or become, Nathaniel Voss belonged to no one, and this was accepted as simply another fact about him, the way his grey eyes were a fact, or his silence, or the particular economy of his movements when he worked. He left within the hour, alone, on a grey gelding that had carried him on a dozen similar errands before this one. The household staff later testified that he took almost nothing with him: a blanket, a hunting knife, a tin of matches, a length of rope, and the folded description Bell had given him of Isaac Mercer. Tall, broad through the shoulders, missing the smallest finger of his left hand, said to speak little and read exceptionally well, better than most men in the county, white or black, a fact Bell mentioned with visible discomfort, as though literacy itself were part of the offence being reported. In the years before that autumn, Nathaniel Voss had built a quiet reputation across 3 counties, a reputation founded less on cruelty, which many men in his line of work cultivated deliberately as a kind of advertisement, than on an unsettling patience. Planters who hired him spoke in letters that survive among family papers scattered through the region, of a man who did not raise his voice, did not carry more weapons than necessary, and rarely returned from an assignment without either the person he had been sent to find or a report detailed enough to satisfy even the most suspicious employer. One such letter, written by a cotton factor in a neighboring county and preserved by his descendants, describes Nathaniel as more clerk than hunter, a compliment in the factor's eyes, meant to convey thoroughness rather than mercy. Nathaniel kept, throughout these years, a small leather notebook in which he recorded distances, weather, and terrain with the same flat precision he might have applied to inventory. And it was this notebook, more than any single skill, that made him valuable to men like Josiah Bell, who preferred results documented cleanly enough to withstand any later question. He had never, in 11 years of such work, been asked to retrieve documents rather than a person. Overseers and owners wanted their laborers returned, or wanted proof of death sufficient to close an account. Bell's request, delivered twice in a lowered voice, struck Nathaniel as unusual enough that he noted it briefly in the leather notebook before he left the porch that morning. Papers first, man after, if at all. He did not yet understand why the distinction mattered so much to Bell, only that it did, and that a man who had made his living reading what people did not say found something worth remembering in the particular order of Bell's instructions. For the first several miles, the trail behaved as trails usually did. Isaac had moved fast through the tree line behind the quarters, staying low along a dry creek bed that any experienced tracker would expect a man running north to use, since the creek fed eventually into a wider stream that led, after 2 days' travel, toward roads used by other fugitives before him. But by midday, at a fork where the creek split around a stand of cypress heavy with hanging moss, the trail turned. Instead of continuing toward the routes that fugitives were known to favor, toward the towns where rumor said certain free black families or discreet ferrymen might offer quiet help, Isaac had gone east. East led toward swamp, toward abandoned rice ground long since surrendered to water and reed, toward nothing that a sensible man running for his freedom would want, and nothing that offered any obvious road to a free state. Nathaniel followed anyway, because that was the nature of the work, and because something in the deliberateness of the turn unsettled him in a way he could not immediately name, though he tried. In the notes he kept in a small leather book that survives only in fragments to describe it, he wrote in one of the few legible lines, "The man is not running from something. He is going toward it." That first night, before he reached any of the marks that would later trouble him more directly, he camped in a stand of pine and reviewed, out of long habit, everything the household had told him about the missing man. Isaac Mercer had come to the Bell estate 11 years earlier, purchased from a family 2 counties over that was liquidating its holdings after a bad cotton season. He had been recorded, at the time of purchase, as unmarried, with no listed kin, a detail that had struck none of the household staff as unusual until later, when it became clear how carefully Isaac had studied the very records that made such omissions possible. He had earned, through what one witness called an unusual patience with numbers, a position inside the main house handling correspondence and inventory, a role that placed him, day after day, within arm's reach of the ledgers Bell kept locked, but not, apparently, well enough locked. By late afternoon of the second day, Nathaniel found the first of the deliberate marks. 3 parallel cuts on the trunk of a water oak, made with a blade, and clearly not the accidental scarring of an animal or a careless machete. A little further on, a small cairn of stones, no taller than a man's boot, stacked with evident care at the base of a fallen log, split by lightning some years before. Later still, a strip of blue cloth tied at eye level on a low branch, faded by weather, but recently knotted, the fibers still stiff rather than softened by rain. These were not the careless traces of a man in flight, dropped by accident or exhaustion. They were placed. They were meant to be found by someone who already knew how to look for such things, and Nathaniel realized, with a discomfort he did not share with anyone at the time, and only much later described in a letter recovered decades afterward and preserved among Ruth Mercer's own papers, that he did know how to look, because he had seen marks like these before, not on bark, on packed dirt, drawn with a stick or a finger by a woman whose face he could no longer picture, and whose voice he could not recall at all, though the shapes themselves, 3 lines, a small circle of stones, a strip of cloth tied at a particular height, sat in his memory with a clarity that nothing else from his early childhood possessed. He had been very young, perhaps 4, perhaps younger. He did not know where the memory came from, only that it was there, waiting, the way an old scar waits under a sleeve until the weather turns and the skin remembers what the mind has otherwise let go. He made camp that second night in the ruin of an old rice barn, one of several such structures that dotted the low country along the rivers of that part of Georgia, most abandoned since the price of rice had fallen and the planters had turned their attention inland toward cotton and the newer fortunes it promised. He did not sleep well. The barn's roof had partly collapsed, and through the gap he could see a section of sky crossed by a thin cloud that did not move for what felt like hours. According to his own later account, given second-hand through Ruth Mercer's testimony and never confirmed by Nathaniel himself in any surviving document, he spent part of that night going through the contents of his own memory the way a man goes through a trunk he has not opened in years, finding objects he does not remember packing, a woman's hands working something small and repetitive, perhaps sewing, perhaps braiding, a smell he could not name, but that returned to him with unusual force whenever he passed certain stands of cypress, a sound, possibly a lullaby, possibly only the rhythm of it without any words attached. He wrote none of this in the leather book, a fact later noted by those who studied the surviving fragments, since almost everything else of substance from the journey found its way onto some page or other. Whatever passed through him that night in the collapsed barn, he seems to have judged it too uncertain, or too private, or too unlike the plain, factual record he had trained himself for years to keep, to set down in ink alongside distances and weather. The following morning he learned from a woman at a neighboring farm who recognized him from earlier work in the county and who was willing to talk once he mentioned Bell's name, that Isaac had spent nearly 3 years working inside the main house, specifically in the small room off the study where Bell kept his contracts, his receipts, and the plantation's ledger of births and deaths among the enslaved population. It was unusual work for a man in Isaac's position, unusual enough that the household staff had noticed and quietly discussed it among themselves, though none of them, the woman said, had ever been told exactly why Bell trusted him with it, or why Bell, a man not known for trusting anyone easily, had made an exception in this single case. The woman also said that in the weeks before his disappearance, Isaac had begun asking questions, carefully and only of people he judged safe, about a woman named Ruth, who had worked on the Bell property nearly 30 years before, and had been sold off and transferred to another owner under circumstances nobody in the county would describe in any detail. She said Bell had forbidden the name to be spoken in his hearing, and that at least one servant had been dismissed from the house years earlier for mentioning it within Bell's earshot, though the official reason given at the time was theft. It was the cook, an older woman who had been on the property longer than almost anyone else still living there, who eventually told Nathaniel more, though she made him swear, gripping his wrist with a strength that surprised him, that he would never say where he had heard it. She said Ruth had given birth to a boy in the spring of 1827. The child, she said, had been unusually light-skinned, lighter than either of Ruth's own parents by a margin that had caused talk among the quarters at the time, talk that was quickly and firmly discouraged. Within days of the birth, the child was recorded as having died of a weakness common enough in infants of that era to raise no particular suspicion on paper. No one on the property, the cook said, lowering her voice further still, could recall ever seeing a burial, a grave marker, or even a specific location where such a burial might have taken place. She said this last part, looking not at Nathaniel but past him, toward the tree line, as though the absence of a grave were itself a kind of evidence she had carried for 30 years without anyone to give it to. Nathaniel wrote none of this down. He continued east. The trail, when he examined it with the full attention the work demanded, revealed something else, something that troubled him more than the marks themselves. It was built for exactly one follower. Isaac had not tried to erase his path entirely, the way a man desperate to vanish completely would have done, doubling back through water, scattering false signs, exhausting every trick a fugitive might use against pursuit. He had left it walkable, deliberately walkable, but only for someone who already possessed the particular and uncommon skill of reading cut bark and stacked stone and knotted cloth at a specific height, a skill that, as far as Nathaniel knew, he had learned from Elias Crane during long afternoons in the woods and from nowhere else. The realization that the trail might have been designed specifically for him, and not merely for whoever the Bell estate happened to send after any runaway, arrived slowly, the way suspicion arrives when a man has spent his whole life being told not to ask questions and has, out of long habit, obeyed. On the third day, he passed through the remains of a small settlement, little more than 4 collapsed cabins, and a well-gone-dry that had once housed workers for an earlier rice operation abandoned before Nathaniel was born. A trapper who used the area for muskrat lines told him he had seen, 2 mornings before, a man matching Isaac's description, moving with purpose rather than panic, walking, not running, as though he knew precisely how much time he had and intended to use every hour of it. The trapper also mentioned, almost as an aside, that the man had stopped at the old well and stood beside it for a long while before continuing east, a detail that meant nothing to Nathaniel at the time, and that he would only understand much later, when Ruth told him the well had once marked the edge of the ground where field hands from an earlier generation, including her own mother, had been permitted to bury their stillborn children when no other ground was offered to them. Back at the Bell property, though Nathaniel would not learn this until much later, the household had already begun settling into an explanation for Isaac's absence that required no further inquiry. Bell told the remaining staff that Isaac had likely drowned attempting to cross the river, a story repeated with such flat confidence that within a week it had hardened, among the people who repeated it, into something close to accepted fact, despite no body, no clothing, and no trace beyond the torn ledger pages ever having been recovered. A visiting cotton buyer who dined at the house during that period later recalled in a letter to a business partner that Bell had mentioned the incident only once, in passing, describing it as regrettable but unremarkable, the sort of loss any large estate absorbed from time to time. The overseer, for his part, quietly redistributed Isaac's former duties in the study among 2 younger men, neither of whom had Isaac's particular skill with figures, and within a month the room itself had been reorganized enough that no one remaining on the property could have reconstructed, even if asked, exactly which ledgers had passed through Isaac's hands during his years there. It was into this settling quiet, days behind him and unknown to him, that Nathaniel continued east, unaware that the household he had left was already smoothing over the very absence he'd been sent to resolve, as though the land itself and the people bound to it had long practice in closing over whatever the surface no longer wished to show. In a hunting cabin 2 days further along, abandoned but recently used, judging by the fresh ash in its hearth and a single set of tracks leading in and back out, he found a single page. It was torn along one edge, in a way that matched, he was fairly certain even in poor light, the missing leaves from Bell's ledger. On it was recorded, in the flat clerical hand typical of such books, the death of an infant named Nathan, son of a woman listed only as Ruth, in the spring of 1827, the same season the cook had described. Beneath this entry, in different ink and evidently added at a later date by a different hand entirely, was a note authorizing a sum of money, the figure smudged but legible enough to be paid to Elias Crane, dated within days of that recorded death. Nathaniel sat with the page for a long time before folding it carefully into the inner pocket of his coat, the same pocket where he kept his small leather notebook. He did not sleep in the cabin that night, choosing instead to make a cold camp some distance away, a habit born of long practice rather than any particular fear, though he later admitted, in the account preserved through Ruth, that he had felt watched in a way that had nothing to do with Isaac Mercer at all. He began, from that point, to understand the shape of what he was walking into, though understanding it and accepting it were, he would learn, two very different processes requiring two very different kinds of courage. Isaac had not run merely to secure his own freedom, though that alone would have been reason enough for any man. He had run to force something into the open, something Belle had spent nearly 3 decades keeping carefully buried beneath false entries and paid silences, and he had chosen, deliberately and at considerable risk to himself, to lead the one man who might be forced to confront it directly, rather than any other man Belle might have sent. The days that followed brought Nathaniel through terrain that tested even his considerable skill. The swamp thickened as he moved nearer the river, and more than once he lost the trail entirely for hours at a stretch, forced to circle wide until he picked up some fragment, a disturbed patch of reed, a print half erased by rising water that confirmed he remained on the correct path. During one such search, wading through water that reached his waist, he came upon the ruin of what had once been a small chapel, used according to a weathered sign nailed to a nearby post, by a traveling minister who had, decades earlier, offered informal baptisms to enslaved people along the river when no formal church would record them. The building's roof had fallen in years before, and its interior had been claimed almost entirely by vine and standing water, but a portion of one wall remained, and on it, faded nearly to nothing, he could make out the ghost of names painted in a careful, deliberate hand, names of infants baptized without surnames, without dates that meant anything beyond the season, without any expectation that the record would ever be examined by anyone beyond the small community that had gathered there to see it made. He stood in that ruined chapel for some time before continuing on, though he never explained in any surviving account what he had felt while he stood there. What is known from a note in his leather book that survived better than most is that he counted the names on the wall twice, arriving at the same number both times, 11, and that he wrote nothing beside the number except a single line drawn beneath it, as though the count itself were the only comment the moment required. Later that same day, still within sight of the river's wider bend, he encountered an old man fishing from a half-sunken skiff who introduced himself, when pressed, only as a former hand from a plantation 2 properties downriver from Belle's. Retired now and living alone in a cabin no one troubled to visit. The old man had heard, in the way that news travelled along the river faster than any road could carry it, that a tracker was moving east through the swamp on Belle's business, and he seemed to have been waiting in no great hurry for that tracker to pass his way. He said little that was new about Isaac Mercer, whom he did not know personally, but he said a good deal, unprompted, about Josiah Belle, describing him as a man who had, in the old man's phrase, a talent for making people disappear without ever raising his voice, a talent the old man said he had watched at work more than once over the decades, though never so plainly as in the case, whispered about even then, of a woman sold off under a name that was not her own. He did not know the woman's name. He knew only that the sale had happened quietly, and that the paperwork, when anyone thought to ask about it years later, had never quite matched what people remembered. He offered Nathaniel a portion of the fish he had caught, which Nathaniel accepted, and the two men sat for a while in a silence that neither seemed to feel any need to fill before Nathaniel continued east. On the fourth night, he lost the horse's cooperation entirely, the animal refusing, for reasons Nathaniel could not determine, to enter a stretch of black water that the trail seemed clearly to require crossing. He tethered the gelding to a stand of cypress and continued on foot, carrying only what he could keep dry above his head, a decision that cost him nearly a full day's supply of matches when the water proved deeper than expected and reached the small tin before he could raise it clear. He noted the loss in his leather book with the same flatness he applied to every other fact of the journey, though a later reader of the surviving fragments observed that the handwriting on that particular page grew noticeably smaller and more cramped than on any page before or after it, as though the man writing it had for the first time since Millhaven allowed himself to feel the size of what he did not yet understand he was walking toward. He passed on the fifth day the remains of what had once been a small burying ground, unmarked by any stone, identifiable only by a pattern in the ground that a less experienced eye would have mistaken for the ordinary unevenness of swamp terrain. He did not know at the time what the ground had been used for, and would not learn until Ruth told him much later that such places existed up and down the river, used by families denied any other ground to lay their dead, remembered by no deed and no register, kept alive only in the memory of the people who had walked past them and, in passing, chosen not to forget. By the sixth day, exhaustion had begun to show in both the man and the horse. He had eaten little, having declined to hunt for fear the sound would carry too far in the flat, sound-conducting stillness of the swamp, and he had slept in snatches, never more than 3 or 4 hours at a time, always with one ear tuned to the particular silence that meant nothing nearby was moving. It was during this stretch that the marks along the trail grew, in his private judgment, almost tender in their placement, as though whoever left them wished not merely to guide a follower, but to reassure one, to tell him, without words, that the path, however strange, however far from any sensible road north, was safe to walk. The trail ended, finally, at an old rice storage building near the Altamaha River, a low brick structure with a single door and no windows, the kind of building that had, according to testimony collected years later by a federal commission gathering accounts from the formerly enslaved population of the region, been used quietly by traders to hold people before private sales, away from the public auction blocks where records were more likely to be kept and questions more likely to be asked. Nathaniel arrived at dusk on the 7th day, his coat torn, his boots ruined by standing water, his horse left tethered some distance back where the ground grew too soft to trust. Inside, by lantern light, he found waiting in a small alcove. He found Isaac Mercer standing beside a woman who appeared to be in her early 50s, her posture upright, despite the evident hardship of whatever journey had brought her there ahead of him. She did not react, as a person reacts to a hunter arriving at the end of a chase. She did not flinch, and she did not run, and she did not reach for the tools Isaac had carried the entire way, tools that Nathaniel understood only later had been meant less for use than for the appearance of preparedness, a kind of quiet dignity maintained in case the outcome had gone differently. Instead, she set 3 objects, slowly and without hurry, on an overturned crate that stood between them. A small child's shirt, yellowed with age, and folded with a care that suggested it had been folded and unfolded many times over many years. An incomplete church record, the kind kept by traveling ministers who baptized enslaved infants informally, without always recording a surname, matching in its faded lettering the ruined wall Nathaniel had passed days earlier. And a letter, written in a hand Nathaniel recognized immediately, with a jolt that he later described as physical rather than merely intellectual, as belonging to Elias Crane, the man who had raised him. The letter, along with what Ruth told him plainly and without embellishment over the several hours that followed, hours during which none of the three of them moved from that small brick room, laid out in full what the ledger page had only implied. Ruth Mercer was his mother. Josiah Bell was his father. Bell, fearing the scandal that a visibly light-skinned child born to an enslaved woman would cause among his creditors, his business partners, and the family whose daughter he intended at the time to marry, had chosen not to sell the infant quietly, as was sometimes done in such cases across the region, but to erase him from the record of the enslaved population entirely, as though erasure were a more merciful, or at least a more convenient, solution than sale. The false entry of death was written into the ledger by Bell's own clerk, on Bell's own instruction. The child was handed to Elias Crane, who was paid, in installments that continued for years, to raise him as a poor orphan of undetermined but presumed white parentage, a story Crane maintained without once breaking his silence for nearly 30 years, even, it seems from the letter, at moments when he might have found it easier to speak than to continue the deception. Ruth herself was sold, within the year, under a different surname entirely, to a family in another county, and Bell continued afterward, through intermediaries whose names appear only as initials in his private account books, to pay for her to be kept at a distance from Georgia, a fact confirmed decades later by financial records recovered piecemeal from the ruins of the Bell estate. When her later owner died without heirs willing to maintain his affairs, she found, at last, an opportunity to escape, and spent the years that followed gathering whatever proof she could assemble, fragment by fragment, letter by letter, witness by witness, that her son had not, in fact, died in the spring of 1827. Isaac had found the proof first, though not by seeking it out for its own sake. Working inside Bell's study, cataloguing and recopying older records at Bell's own instruction, part of a broader effort by Bell to consolidate decades of scattered paperwork into a single, more presentable set of books, Isaac had noticed inconsistencies that a less careful or less literate man might easily have missed, dates that did not align cleanly with the seasons they claimed to describe, payments recorded with no stated purpose beyond a set of initials, a death recorded for a child whose grave no one on the property, when Isaac quietly asked, could ever locate. He had not gone looking for Nathaniel Voss specifically, had not even known, at first, that the tracker sometimes hired to pursue runaways from the Bell estate was connected to any of it. He had gone looking for the truth of his own community's history, curious in the way a careful reader becomes curious about a book with missing pages, only to find that the ledger's falsifications extended far beyond one infant, far beyond one grieving mother. The pages he had eventually torn free and carried with him did not document only Nathaniel's birth. They showed, in aggregate, that Bell had, over many years, altered identities, invented deaths, and separated families in order to conceal debts, illegal transfers, and sales made outside the boundaries of what even the thin and self-serving laws of the time technically permitted. Several people recorded as deceased on the Bell ledgers had in fact been resold under new names to other estates, their deaths on paper allowing Bell to avoid certain taxes and certain obligations tied to manumission promises made and quietly broken. The plantation's continued operation, it became clear to Isaac as he worked, and clear to Nathaniel now as he listened, depended in some meaningful part on people who existed nowhere in any official record at all, people who had been, in the driest and most bureaucratic sense, erased. Nathaniel understood, sitting in that brick building with the lantern burning low and throwing long shadows across the crate between them, exactly why Bell had been so insistent that the papers be recovered before Isaac reached any town, any courthouse, any newspaper willing to print an inconvenient truth. It was not only that his own reputation would be destroyed if the ledger reached a courtroom or an abolitionist press. Other planters, Other families whose names appeared in those same pages through sales and transfers, arranged with Bell's quiet cooperation, would be implicated as well. And the whole quiet architecture of mutual convenience that bound the county's landowners together would be threatened by a handful of torn pages carried east through a swamp. And more than this, more than the money or the reputation, was the fact that Bell had spent nearly a decade using his own son, unknowingly, to hunt down men and women attempting to escape the very system built, in part, to hide that son's existence. Nathaniel had, without ever knowing it, spent years capturing people who were, in the broadest and cruelest possible sense, extensions of his own severed family, people whose freedom he had personally foreclosed while believing himself merely a hired hand doing honest, ordinary work. Isaac, for his part, told Nathaniel that night that he had recognized, somewhere in the middle of his own quiet cataloguing, that the falsified entries were not isolated to Ruth's case alone. He had begun, in the months before his escape, keeping a private list of names, drawn from patterns in the ledger that repeated themselves with a regularity too consistent to be accidental. A death recorded, followed within a season by an unexplained payment to some individual outside the estate, followed, if one searched far enough in neighboring county records, by the reappearance of a name closely resembling the deceased, sold at a fair some distance away under slightly altered spelling. He had counted, by the time of his escape, 11 such patterns, a number that struck Nathaniel, when Isaac spoke it aloud, with a force he could not immediately explain, until he remembered the 11 names painted on the ruined chapel wall days before, a number he had counted twice without understanding at the time why it mattered enough to record. Isaac said he could not be certain all 11 patterns represented what he suspected, only that the evidence was consistent enough to demand a more thorough accounting than any single man working alone in a locked study could provide, which was, he said, part of why he had ultimately decided to take the pages rather than simply memorize what he had found. A memory could be denied. A page, examined by the right hands, could not so easily be argued away. When her later owner died without heirs willing to maintain his affairs, she found, at last, an opportunity to escape, and spent the years that followed gathering whatever proof she could assemble, fragment by fragment, letter by letter, witness by witness, that her son had not, in fact, died in the spring of 1827. Ruth described, in the account she gave that night, and repeated in substance decades later before the commission, the particular difficulty of gathering such proof as a woman sold under a false name, moved from county to county at the convenience of others, with no standing before any court and no expectation that her word alone would be believed against a planter's ledger. She had relied, she said, on the memories of other women who had worked in the Bell household during those years, women who had since scattered across 3 states, but who had, in a handful of cases, agreed to put what they remembered into letters, written in careful and often borrowed handwriting, that she carried with her sewn into the lining of a second, older bag she did not open that night, saying only that its contents were for a court, if a court should ever exist willing to hear them, and not for a single tired man standing in a rice building at the end of a long chase. She spoke, too, of the years she had spent teaching herself to read well enough to follow the outlines of the very legal language that had been used against her, so that when Isaac finally wrote to her through a network of correspondence she never fully described even to Nathaniel, to say that he believed he had found the ledger entry she had spent decades searching for, she was able to understand, from his brief and careful description, precisely what he had found before she ever saw the page herself. He asked Ruth, at one point during that long night, why she had not simply come to him directly, why the trail, why the marks, why the elaborate and dangerous months of preparation that clearly lay behind Isaac's careful cataloguing, and Ruth's own long journey back toward the county she had every reason to fear. Ruth's answer, preserved in the account Nathaniel later gave, and that survives only through Ruth's own subsequent testimony, was that she had feared, above everything else, that a man raised entirely inside Bell's world, taught since childhood to trust the very structures that had erased his mother, would not believe a stranger's claim, however documented. He would need, she said, to find it himself, mark by mark, page by page, the way he had been trained to find anything, before he could trust it enough to act on it. He did not take Isaac back to the Bell property. According to Ruth's later testimony, given years afterward and preserved in the Commission's records, he walked with them both, once the lantern had burned low and the first grey light had begun to show through the building's single door, to a stretch of the river some miles further on, where a commercial boat captain, known privately among certain circles to accept payment for transporting fugitives without asking questions he did not wish answered, was waiting on a schedule arranged weeks earlier through channels Nathaniel never fully understood and never asked to have explained. He paid what money he carried and what the small amount of coin sewn into the lining of his coat, saved from years of solitary work, could add to it. Then, to protect them from immediate and organized pursuit, he returned alone to Millhaven and reported, with the flat, credible delivery that had served him well in years of similar reports, that Isaac Mercer had died somewhere in the swamp, taking the stolen ledger pages down with him into water too deep and too treacherous to search, a plausible enough end for a man attempting so unlikely a route. Bell pretended to accept this account, county correspondence recovered after the war, fragments of it preserved among the papers of a neighboring family who had corresponded with Bell on unrelated matters, suggests he did not believe it for more than a few days. Within a week, he had begun quietly circulating an accusation that Nathaniel Voss had stolen money from the estate, and had moreover assisted enslaved people in escaping, a claim serious enough under the laws and customs of the time to make Nathaniel one of the most actively sought men in the region almost overnight. A reward notice, later filed among county records and rediscovered during post-war archival work undertaken in the 1860s by a small group of local historians attempting to reconstruct the county's wartime and antebellum documentation, described him as dangerous, dishonest, and possibly, in Bell's own carefully chosen phrasing, belonging to a race other than that recorded in his papers, a phrase that historians examining the notice a century later would note as unusually specific for a document of its kind, and unusually revealing of a fear that had nothing to do with theft at all. The notice offered a sum considerably larger than what was typically posted for a runaway labourer, a discrepancy several later researchers pointed to as evidence that Bell's true concern lay less with the missing money than with the missing man himself, and with whatever that man might one day choose to say, to whom, and in front of which courthouse steps. No one in Millhaven, as far as any surviving record shows, ever saw Nathaniel Voss again. Elias Crane, questioned briefly by county officials in the weeks that followed, gave conflicting and evasive answers about the young man he had raised, and died 2 years later without, as far as anyone recorded, ever clarifying them. The formal investigation into Isaac Mercer's disappearance and into Nathaniel's alleged theft and complicity produced surprisingly little paperwork, given the seriousness of the accusations, a fact that later historians attributed to Bell's own reluctance to invite too close an examination of his estate's finances. A county magistrate's brief notation, dated some 6 weeks after Nathaniel's return and subsequent flight, records only that the matter was considered closed for lack of a suspect to prosecute, an unusually thin conclusion for a case that had, for a short time, made Nathaniel's name known well beyond the borders of Millhaven. Bell offered a reward, renewed twice over the following 2 years according to surviving newspaper notices, but no credible sighting was ever reported to him, and the reward notices grew shorter and less specific with each renewal, as though even Bell's own conviction in the pursuit had begun to erode. Ruth and Isaac reached, according to fragments preserved in the Commission's later records, a community some distance north, where they were able to settle under names they had chosen for themselves, rather than names assigned to them by anyone else's ledger. Isaac, the records suggest, spent much of the remainder of his life working with organizations that helped others locate family members separated by sale, a labor that friends who knew him in later years described as tireless and at times visibly difficult for him to speak about even among people he trusted. One acquaintance, interviewed by a local newspaper decades afterward for an unrelated story about the community's founding families, recalled that Isaac kept, until his own death, a single torn page from an old ledger, framed and hung in his home, though he would never explain to visitors what it recorded or why he had chosen to display it rather than simply keep it filed away. Ruth, for her part, is remembered in the same community's oral histories as a woman who spoke rarely of the years before her escape, but who taught, informally and without payment, any child in the settlement who wished to learn letters, a practice several former students later connected, in their own recollections, to the church record she had carried with her out of the swamp, as though having once needed proof that could not be produced, she had resolved that no child under her care would ever face the same absence. She kept, according to the same oral histories, the small child's shirt she had shown Nathaniel that night in the brick building for the rest of her life, and it is said to have passed, after her death, to a granddaughter who could not say with certainty which infant it had first belonged to, only that her grandmother had called it, on the rare occasions she spoke of it at all, the only thing Bell's household had never managed to write into a ledger. One of the settlement's founding families, interviewed for the same local newspaper piece that recorded Isaac's framed ledger page, recalled that Ruth kept a second, smaller habit as well, less remarked upon at the time, but noted afterward by more than one former neighbor. Each spring, without explanation, she walked some distance from her home and returned some hours later, with mud on her shoes, a habit no one in the community ever asked her to account for, and one she never volunteered to explain, though those who knew her longest came to understand it, without needing to be told outright, as a kind of private visiting to a place that held no stone and no name, but that she had evidently decided to remember anyway. Decades later, after the war had ended, and the old plantation economy with it, Ruth Mercer gave formal testimony to a federal commission charged with gathering accounts from the formerly enslaved population of the region, her statement recorded by a clerk working for the commission. Her statement, brief and precise in the manner of someone who has told a painful story enough times to have worn its edges smooth, was filed alongside a partial recovery of the Bell estate's ledgers, which by then had passed through several hands, survived several fires, and arrived at the Commission's offices in a condition described by the clerk, who catalogued them as fragmentary but legible in the sections that mattered most. She spoke of her son. She described him not as a man wronged so much as a man who had, in the end, chosen correctly at the one moment it counted, whatever had been done to shape him before that moment arrived. She did not know at the time of her testimony whether he was alive, and said so plainly, without asking the commission for help in locating him, as though she understood already that he had chosen a kind of disappearance that no commission could reasonably undo. Nathaniel never came forward, in any surviving record, to confirm any part of her account, and no death record for him, and no further trace of him under the name Nathaniel Voss has ever been located in the archives of Georgia or any neighboring state. Isaac, in a separate and much shorter statement given to the same commission on a different day, said only that he had gone looking for a woman's grave, and found instead that there had never been one, and that the man sent to stop him had, by the end of it, understood the difference between a grave that does not exist and a person who was never allowed to. The last document connected to the case is the reward notice from 1857. Its edges worn thin and its ink faded to a pale brown, kept for over a century in a county archive before being properly catalogued by a local historical society in the 1960s. Its condition by then fragile enough that archivists chose to photograph rather than further handle the original page. On the reverse side, in handwriting that does not match Bell's own hand, and that has never been identified, despite several attempts by researchers to compare it against known signatures from the household in the county, someone had written a single line, undated, unsigned, and never explained by any accompanying note. It said that the man sent to hunt a runaway had discovered that his own first capture had been himself. Local historians who examined the notice in the 1960s, cross-referencing it against what remained of the Bell ledgers and the Commission's post-war testimonies, could not determine when the line on the reverse had been added, or by whom, or whether the hand belonged to a clerk, a descendant, or someone with no official connection to the case at all, who had simply come across the notice, read it, and felt compelled to leave behind a single sentence for whoever might read it next. The same historical society, in the course of its research, attempted to trace what had become of the 11 names Isaac Mercer had once listed in his private accounting, cross-referencing them against surviving bills of sale, county tax rolls, and church registers from 3 neighboring states. Their published findings, modest in length and cautious in tone, confirmed with reasonable certainty 5 of the 11 cases, identifying individuals who appeared to have been recorded as deceased on the Bell estate, only to reappear, under slightly altered names, in the records of other properties within the same decade. The remaining 6 cases, the Society concluded, could not be confirmed or ruled out, given the fragmentary state of the surviving documents, a conclusion the report's authors noted without further comment. Alongside a brief description of the burying ground Nathaniel had once passed unknowingly on the 5th day of his journey, a ground the Society's surveyors located again in the 1960s using an old county map and a description provided, second-hand, by descendants of the community Ruth and Isaac had eventually settled in further north. No further trace of Josiah Bell's own fate appears in any record consulted by the Society. His estate passed in the years following the war through a series of debts and partial sales that left little of the original property intact, and the main house itself, according to a brief note appended to the Society's report, had by the time of their research long since burned, the exact date and cause unrecorded, remembered locally only as a fire that no one in the area seemed to regret. The notice remains in the archive today, its front side offering a description written to make one man appear dangerous, and its reverse side offering, in a stranger's quiet hand, something closer to the truth. Between those 2 sides, front and back of the same worn page, sits the whole of what can still be known for certain about a tracker who was sent to find one missing man and returned by the only route that seems to have ever made sense of the journey, to the mother he had never known he had lost.